Welcome back to the Return to Virtue podcast with me and AJ Barker. We are discussing current affairs today that matter for men and for women, but through the lens of the virtue ethics of Aristotle and St. Thomas. We're looking at justice today. AJ, great to see you again.
Great to see you, buddy. How are we doing?
Yeah, doing really well, thanks. So justice is a bit different from the cardinal virtues we've looked at so far because everything else has been mainly about the problems we face as individuals being acted upon. But justice is a social virtue rather than an individual one, in that it's mainly about how we act upon others, right?
Yep, it's an external action, an external virtue. The other ones moderate inwardly. This one moderates dealings outwardly. I think one cool comment that Thomas makes is that he asks the question of whether it is properly in the will versus being like in the intellect, or it could be in the sensitive appetites, the concupiscible or irascible. He says it's not in the sensitive appetites. He says, but it's not in the intellect. It's not just how you think about others. He says it's what you actually do toward others, and for that reason, it's in the will, because the will desires and then does. It desires and does. So again, this justice is one that moderates our will and how we act toward others, giving to them their due.
It's one that's very poorly understood today because I think one of the things that secular liberalism really drills into people is that we are atomized and we don't really have these serious obligations to ancestors, certainly not to God, which is dismissed. God is dismissed by secular liberalism. But the idea that we are just atomized and we only have to really make ourselves happy in life and just do whatever we feel like. And there's that caveat that, well, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. But really, once you understand justice, it goes so much further than that. It's not just about not hurting anyone else. It's about giving other people what you owe them.
Yeah. Yeah, and the relation ones are going to be huge.
Right.
Employer to employee, governor to citizens, again, father to son, husband to wife, right? These are the things, man toward God. Like these are the things when we think about each of these virtues, and there's something we're trying to learn, something we're trying to study. This is what we're trying to study: is what are the right relations between these things, between these sort, again, positions of relationship, and how do we act, and what do we owe to each other, out of just their basic right.
Yeah. And this goes right to the core of what it means to be human and the rational animal, because we're also social as a result of our rationality. Aristotle said that the man who lives outside the city is either going to be a beast or a god. And you have to get these fundamental relationships right, starting with man and God, but also within the family and wider society. You have to get them right if you're going to do a good job at being a human being. This is why Plato just equated justice broadly with general human rightness. And Aristotle, commenting on that, writes that justice in this sense is not part of virtue, but virtue entire.
Yeah. Yeah, I put this little note in our pre-show, prep notes, but there's something like the just man is something like what we'd call the good man nowadays, but not in a cynical way. We're talking about someone who it's like they have high integrity. Usually they'll do things, they've done things throughout their life that sacrifices a lot of personal costs, and they persevere in it. They're very honest in their speech. They're not playing games. They're very humble. They're courteous, but they're just on it. They're disciplined. And we'd kind of look at that person, we say, all right, that's a good man, right? And that's the idea of what's going on in justice. The person who's cultivated the virtue of justice, you look at them and you go, that's a good man, right? So our show today is talking about like how do we build that? First off, what is that consistent? And then how do we build it? How do we grow?
Yeah, that's a great example of the fact that virtue is really about just becoming strong.
Yeah.
Even etymologically, it tells us this is about virility and strength. A
Yep.
just man is competent, and to use like slang, you just say like he's real. He understands what his duties are day to day. He doesn't let people down. You can depend on him.
Yep. Yep. Here, let me and let me tee this one up so we can kind of dive into it. But I always find this is a great way to start with justice, with the etymology, the root of the word. justice, justus, justus, jus is law or right, and justice is the administration of the law. So justice is, if law is something like it regulates the interaction between things, okay, and then justice is the administration of that. So you can think about it like, when that interaction between things goes wrong, justice is going to be the thing that corrects it or makes it right. So at its most fundamental level, the concept of justice here, we're actually talking prior to the virtue of justice, which is going to be a habit of virtue, how we incline toward this. But just the concept of justice has something to do with like rewarding every good deed perfectly and punishing every bad deed perfectly. And in this way, God is perfectly just, right? God doesn't, properly speaking, God doesn't have to habituate. He knows all things in one moment. But God's divine justice is the way that he accounts for every single good thing and every single evil thing perfectly. All right. And in this way, too, this is why the saints, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine was big on this. They would always hit on this, that in God, justice and mercy are not two separate things. They're perfectly united in each other. So every single act of justice is going to be an act of mercy, and every single act of mercy is actually going to be an act of justice as well. Now, we're going to struggle to see that at times, but it's the way that it is. And we'll give some tips that can hopefully help people begin to intuit why it is that every single act of justice is actually merciful and every single act of mercy is just. But hopefully this just lays the groundwork where, all right, so the concept of justice, it's the administration of the law. It's rewarding good things and punishing bad things. All right. So first point, the just man does not let things go. They don't just let their kids do whatever, their students do whatever, or their friends do whatever. That's actually an act of injustice.
Right. I was just about to mention that from my classroom experience. The teacher who doesn't make the kids complete the assignments or who doesn't maintain discipline in the classroom is making it so that they can't learn and make progress. And eventually those
Yeah.
kids, although it might feel fun to begin with, they recognize they've been failed. That's one of the ways you can actually lose the respect of a class. Whereas if you are just, if you're giving them what you owe them, which is you owe them discipline so they can progress, you owe them the hard assignment so they can improve there too. That's what they actually want. That's what's good for them. And that's how you win respect. But nowadays, the idea that you might be strict or punish is very hostile to this liberal idea that people are just fine as they are and we just have to leave them, let them be so they find their own way. That's not what people need, and it's actually an injustice to treat them that way.
That's right. Like, so a father who lets their kids do whatever, lets their wife just whatever goes. These are going to be actually failings in justice. So this is going to be a lack of the virtue of justice. And
Right.
another one that can give people context, because justice, again, it's something we first have to understand certain things, principles that we then work from and how we're interacting. Right. One of these principles is that the whole is always greater than the parts. Well, in our modern world, we live in an individualistic society. So you'll hear it all the time in classrooms, teaching theories, pedagogy, like, every single individual kid matters. That's actually not true. The whole of the classroom is what matters, right? You have a classroom environment in a classroom. So it's actually a matter of justice for a teacher to kick out the bad student, to not allow someone's, shenanigans to continue on. It's actually a matter of justice because why? They owe it to the whole of the classroom, not that one individual who they view as that person who, oh, I have to go save that one person. Listen, there's a time for that, right? And there's a context for that. And in your church community, your parish, and the Lord, he comes to each individual one, right? Any sheep that has run away, he rejoices over them returning more than the 99 that are there. Okay, God pays attention to each individual. But when you're running an operation, when you're in a class, when you're in a community, you have to pay attention to the good of the whole. You can't change prison laws for the one person because you're like, well, what about their circumstance and these things, and take all these. No. It's the good of the whole that matters, right? And so you can actually tell when, say, a lawyer is an unjust person, or a district attorney or a government more broadly is unjust, because the good of the whole starts to fall apart.
Mm.
They start to sacrifice it for one individual here and there,
Right.
right? And it all starts to crumble. And so that's actually a matter of injustice. Thomas Aquinas said, building on Aristotle, that if a district attorney or a prosecutor, all right, wrongly prosecutes, meaning they let someone go when they should have been punished, that's actually an act of injustice. And they, being a public figure, owe restitution to the community, to the state. And what they always said is the first thing is they owe back their wages of what they earned as a prosecutor, as a judge. If they're a judge in that case, if they judge wrongly, if they let someone go for a guilty crime, they are not the ones that should be administering the mercy, right?
Yep.
It's not the judge's place. They have a duty, and that duty means that they are going to punish wrongs and reward rights. They should not punish an innocent man, but they should not be letting a guilty man go. And when they do it, it's an injustice toward the state. And what, again, Thomas said is they actually owe their wages back to the state with compensation. So when we get to satisfaction, we'll touch on that note about compensation, where it's a little bit added extra.
Yeah. So based. That's what got me interested in virtue ethics, because it deals with the nitty gritty, concrete situations like that, and coming at it through the lens of patriarchy and thinking about what we owe families and ancestors and nations. Justice is such a rich concept, and it really explodes this idea that we don't really owe anyone anything, and our life is just about trying to amuse ourselves, which is what kids mostly are actually taught today. Do whatever makes you feel happy. What you're saying there about kicking the naughty kid out of class, you can actually apply that principle to capital punishment. Like, it's deserved, it's just, and it's good for the common good as well, good for society. So I like the way you've set that out there, and the concept of the judge in particular reminded me of how you can't be just without fortitude, for example. Like, making the tough decision is going to require him to have fortitude. So often when you get someone who's in a position of authority and they act in a way that is unjust, it's because they lack the other virtues. We were talking about how they're all tied together, strictly speaking. So that's a perfect example of it. Right.
Yeah, and building on that as well is, like, if you don't have some measure of temperance, you're going to struggle in your dealings toward others.
Oh,
Why?
sure.
It's gonna be kind of like a vortex that just sucks back toward your own self-interest.
Right.
Things are going to be for your own, your own greed, your own desires, your own and your own cravings. And
You
so
take
you're going to
bribes.
struggle. Yep, you're going to struggle in your due actions toward others. And then
Right.
fortitude, like you said, just so well laid out. I mean, it's hard. Fortitude, again, it's something like, again, as we said last week, it's the firm resolve in the face of a difficult good.
Right.
Right? Some difficult thing that you're facing, it's hard to do it. Well, it's hard to have to call out your wife on something. Like, it is hard because everyone knows it's all right. They might, at least early on, especially when you're trying to establish that sort of relationship virtue, like, this might get real blowback, and you have to do it patiently and clearly, right? And sort of distinctly, but you have to assert it.
Yeah.
And you
And
say, hey,
if
no,
you don't do
that's
it,
not right.
you don't actually love her, because love is about the
Yeah.
willing of the objective good of the other person. That's like
Yep.
I said, not going into the theory of this in depth, but I had a tweet a while back where I just said, if your wife is fat, it's your fault. Because the husband, as the authority figure, the head of the household, is supposed to be looking after everyone's physical health as well as spiritual and the rest of it.
Yeah.
And look, if you got this disordered marriage where under your watch, your wife is damaging her health and shortening her life, and your kids are going to suffer as a result of that, what are you doing? You're not loving her properly. But again, that's anti-egalitarian, it's anti-feminist, because the idea is that you actually have a duty to her to oversee her and correct her because you are the leader, right?
Yep. And that's like you said, first and foremost, it's going to take fortitude, because you got to be able to say stuff. You got to be able to take the blowback. That's the thing. You're going to get blowback for this stuff. You're going to get blowback from, the parents when you kick the kid out of class. I mean, it's the same thing. Even as a parent, a lot of people won't understand this comment because they only, have one or two kids, and that's all they're ever going to have. But even a parent to their children, first off, your first duty is to your spouse. Second is to your children. And then if you have a child, say you have 5, 6 children, you have one who goes rogue, you have a duty to that family as a whole to not allow that sort of toxic member to be dragging down the whole thing. Now, you can still work, patiently and individually with them on the side to cultivate it. But ultimately, as they start to age, there's a point where you say, hey, you're not a part of this family, the participatory reality of this family now going forward. And that obviously would be hard on anyone. And most people would sit there and go, wait, what? This is your kid. But no, you have an actual duty to the good of the whole. All right. And so that's one that it's good for a parent to even know that when their child is born, to put a rightful sort of barrier and distance. It's so easy to make a child an idol in one's
Right.
life, especially if one is facing any form of despair. It's very easy when spouses are in the thick of it and they're at loggerheads with each other for one of them to turn and make the child the idol, right?
Right.
It's not appropriate. You have to cultivate. I always say the child is like the leaves of a tree. You don't water a tree by watering the leaves. You have to water the roots, and the
Mm,
roots are the husband and wife, right?
right.
And so you have to, as parents, you have to constantly work to counter that effort to make the child an idol,
Right.
right? And you have to
You,
turn to each other.
you're married to your wife, not to your kids. The one
Yeah.
flesh union is between husband and wife. I deal all the time with guys who've got this wrong, got that order of charity wrong in
Yep.
their marriage. And it's run on for 5, 10 years. And there's
Yep.
separation, there's divorce, because they haven't understood what their actual duties are. It's possible to turn it around, but you really see how in them there's this effeminacy that's stopping them from actually being just in their dealings with their family members. So comes back to that
Yeah.
point, no justice without fortitude that we're talking about earlier. Or sometimes it's
Yep.
intemperance too, but you've got to get these things right. Okay, so
Yeah. Yeah.
justice we've got here, it's not just the habit of giving others their due, but the perpetual and constant will, or the firm habit. So, like with all virtue, this is a skill that we have to actually cultivate in ourselves and ingrain. You don't become a just man just because you've done one just thing in your day. It's actually something that you have to habituate, because that's what virtue is all about, the habits, right?
Yep. Yep. And so for starters, right? Because we're talking too about how people start to understand it and internalize it. For starters, the first sort of area of justice that we want to focus on is our speech. Are we speaking honestly? And I always like this word forthrightly, right? So it's not, we don't want those sort of faults of omission where you're just not mentioning the stuff. We have to have that forthrightness and that honesty. Let's see, Ludwig Ott in his Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma points out that veracity is the correspondence between what one thinks and what they say, and then fidelity is the correspondence between what one says and what one does. And Ludwig Ott points out that God is perfectly possesses veracity and perfectly possesses fidelity. So what he thinks, he says, or he promulgates, he makes known, and then what he promulgates, makes known, is perfectly in line with what he does. Okay, so for us, looking from our angle, the first thing we're trying to do is we're trying to have that sort of twofold correspondence between what we think and what we say, and what we say and what we do. And we have to work at that. We have to cultivate that very intentionally and very seriously, because it's so easy, especially in our fallen nature, but also the habits of our time where we live in a gossip culture, and it's easy and quick to communicate. We have to really work on saying, okay, I'm going to really make sure that the things that I think align with the things that I say. Now, one quick, anticipating an objection here. It's not virtuous if you're going around telling people that you think they're pieces of trash because that's what you actually think. All right. There's a sense in which there's a correspondence between what you think and what you're saying. All right. But now it's ordered toward something evil, toward something wicked. Right. So the real reality is actually that if you're thinking something that's really kind of wicked or wrathful or evil, contemptuous towards someone else, you actually have to rebuke that internally first. You have to say, no, no, no. Hey, you have to call it out yourself. All right, that's contempt. That's against the law of charity. I'm not going to allow that to sort of hang around inside of me and just fester and build. I'm going to call that out, say no to it. So that then when you do speak, and you're speaking kindly and sincerely and gently and patiently, now it actually does align with what you think. That's the real key. It's not that every single time you feel an irritation with someone, you have to let them know how irritated you are. That's actually a sign of immaturity. All right, unrestraint, inability to regulate or discipline oneself. But
Mm.
when you are thinking that, you have to rebuke it, so that now what you think is falling in line with what you're going to say. And what you say, yes, you do want it ordered toward goodness, politeness, those sorts of things. You don't make politeness the highest value in this, but it's a virtue. It aligns with that sort of fourth or fifth prong of the natural law, which is a desire for harmony in society,
Right.
right? So we do have a natural virtue toward gregariousness, kindness, politeness. These are real things. It's not just a sort of falsified notion by, I don't know, bourgeois people or something. It's like,
No.
no, you should be striving for that. But again, where you get that veracity is then you have to correct the inner thought, the mental world, the inner thoughts when they start going rogue.
Yeah. Affability is important. It's like social
Yeah.
lubricant because we have to live alongside each other. So even when you're correcting someone, you want to do it with charity and to try to make it clear that this is because you want everything to work out better for everyone involved. And
Yeah.
just as fortitude is closer to rashness than it is to cowardice, I feel that guys who have this urge to tell the hard truths and really say what they think, no matter how it might make anybody else feel, facts over feelings, that meme.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's that tendency, just as there is with men who are pumped up and willing to do difficult, risky activities. They tend more towards rashness than cowardice. There's a tendency in guys who are forthright, plain speaking, don't care if the truth hurts people, to neglect that element of tactfulness and charity. So it's
Yeah.
worth restraining that in yourself and remembering that you lean more towards the excess of it, right?
Yeah, yeah, and reality TV is our prime example of this, where the people, the people get selected for the shows. These psychologists do these personality, assessments, and then pick the people that are going to mix and combust and make for addictive TV watching. But there's that sense in reality TV shows that you have the people who they keep it real, they say what's on their mind, but it's like everything they're saying is vile, is contemptuous, is gossip. Like this is not a virtue, right? And not because they're not being honest with what they're thinking. They are being honest about what they're thinking, but it's not ordered toward a good end,
Right.
right? So we can't properly call it a virtue at that point,
Mm.
right? And so now it's vice. And so you need those two things. The first thing we want to do is we want to be correcting our inner thoughts, our inner mind, and correct it according to the law of God, right? The wisdom of God, right? And then we want to be speaking truthfully and honestly and forthrightly. So that does mean, yes, if you do have a problem with something, if you have a problem in your relationship, if you have a problem in your family, you can't just gloss over it and act as if it's not there, right? Now, that doesn't, like we're saying, you still address it tactfully, right? Sort of taking into account the whole picture, honestly, forthrightly. Hey, this is not working out, right? If it's you with your spouse, hey, we've got to work on this dynamic. All right, I'm seeing this over and over again. Spend some time maybe preparing, but don't spend too long, right? Where you put it off. It's like, okay, but now you have to address this. That's that forthrightness, right? If
Yep.
you're discontent in your work every single day, no, it might not be appropriate for you to right away jump up and leave the job. However, you should be moving toward a next job. You should be working toward a situation. You should be working toward the rectification of that situation, because it's not right for a human soul to be living in a place where they hate it, where they're miserable, and they're not correcting it. Now, some of it you can do by yourself, saying, you know what, I don't like my pay. Okay, well, did you sign on to that pay? Take the parable of the day's wages. The workers in the vineyard. They come in the morning for one day's wages, they accept it. Well, at the end of the night, the master gives the same wages to the person who comes in for 1 hour. And then the people at the beginning of the day are mad because at the end of the day, they're getting the same pay as them. And he goes, did I not give you what we agreed upon? Okay, then is my generosity to someone else anything to do with you? Do you have any reason? So you can do things like that. Like if you're unhappy in work, try and see, like, okay, is there an element of envy, right? Is there an element of dissatisfaction based on what other people are getting? And then you have to really be honest with yourself, like, okay, maybe I dislike that. I don't think that person deserves this money, but you know what? I signed on for this contract, for this situation.
Mm.
Okay. And it's the society's, by the way, it's the society's role to regulate when someone is being dealt totally unjust wages, which does occur. and it does, occur, not just in our size, but throughout the world. And that is a problem, right? But again, that onus falls on really on the society there to recognize that. And we have to look again, we'd have to look more deeply at these practices of lending with interest and other things. Again, economics is a moral science. We have to look at the morals. How are we regulating our interactions with people, our expectations of things, right? It
Yeah.
is wrong when someone has no other option but to make a wage that is so petty that they can't even survive on it.
Yeah,
However,
hence
it's a
so
long
many
road.
of the popes have talked about the importance of a
Yes.
living wage so that
Yes.
fathers can support their families on one income and have the wives at home.
Right. But we're not talking, the church is not talking communism here, because it
No.
more robustly critiques communism. They're not saying the state needs to jump in and equalize every wage. What we are saying though is that when a society starts leaning on usury, on the banking practices that we have alive, well, now you're going to suck the value out of that society, and the money is going to deflate in value, right? It's going to inflate in terms of its worth, but for us, it's going to become less valuable
Right.
for each of us. And now your wages won't cover the things to live. And that's a problem, right?
Yep.
That is a problem. But the answer to that is not saying, hey, we're going to pull from this person and give it over here, but rather we're going to say, well, it would say all the people who are getting money in pointless pursuits, things that aren't adding to things, we need to start to eradicate that. We need to outlaw that.
Yeah.
The way the church always pointed to it is that bankers should be like toward a median wage in a society,
Mm.
toward a median wage, if not below it. Why? Because they're not the ones adding the fruits of direct labor. The labor that they're doing is nominal at best. Well, now, everyone knows that if a young man is ambitious, what do they head toward? Finance or law, right? Finance or law. Well, both these are bloated industries that don't need more stuff. Okay, so you know what? When they're making a lot of money, that could be a broader question of injustice. However, you on your individual level, me on my level, I actually am not put in a position in our society to regulate that. Okay. So I have to look at me. Did I say yes to this job, to this wage? And if I did, right, okay, then let me correct myself if I start brooding over a sort of discontentment in my work. All right, let me do this. What does the Lord want me to do here? Whatever it is. It could be in a role as a teacher. It could be in a role in business. It could be in a role in you toward your colleagues,
Mm.
right? Toward your fellow employees. How can I cultivate where I am here right now? So that should temper it somewhat. But then, yeah, if it persists, if there's a sort of awareness of a problem there, then it's working toward rectifying that situation by most often creating a new situation.
Yeah. What you said there about banking and law is really interesting. Sir John Glubb wrote a short book about what he observed about the fall of nations just across the whole of human history, all nations,
Yeah.
pagan, Christian, and he identified a few different stages. And one of the key transitions he talked about was between what he called the age of conquest and the age of commerce. And in the
Mm.
age of conquest, when people are fired up, really virile and full of this sense of honor and wanting to build a civilization and honor their gods, he says that glory and honor are the principal objects of ambition. But in the age of commerce, gradually the desire to make money seems to gain hold of the public. And then
Mm.
glory and honor, those become empty words. And he writes that to the merchant in particular, they're empty because they add nothing to the bank balance. So when you lose that sense of glory and honor is really about justice because it's what you owe yourself and other people as well. Once money becomes the idol instead, then he said the rot really sets in, and it's not long before we move through affluence to decadence and eventually decay. So
Yeah.
the fact that these industries in particular are the ones that people are aspiring to be a part of and they have high social status, that's really a marker of cultural decline.
Yeah, yeah, very clearly. The easiest way to put it for people if there are questions, well, what about interest? Isn't it isn't usury like excessive interest? No, technically, usury is charging interest on money. Why? Because money is itself not fertile. It doesn't copulate. That's in the Merchant of Venice. There's that one liner that that my money is copulating like rabbits, something like that. And money is stale and sterile. And so to use money to make more money is going to be unjust, right? But here's another way to put it very clearly for people. Any industry that becomes normative for people to get loans to pay for that thing is going to inevitably see inflation automatically. Why? Because it's now no longer a transaction in the present, and the future is infinite. So you can make that loan longer and longer. You can make that interest rate more and more subtle, but over longer periods of time. So every single industry or area of commerce that gets normatively subject to loans is going to see inflation occur. And so we have that in schooling, we have that in healthcare, we have that in, and by the way, that doesn't matter if you're over in Britain and you guys have, universal healthcare. It's still going to inflate for the government,
Mm.
right? And all these institutions buying houses, cars, they're all going to see that. And that's meaningful for the person who's the banker, all right? For the person who owns the company, they're going to sign off on it, right? They're going to say, you know what? You're telling me that we can put on our balance sheet a price that's $10,000 more, 10,000 pounds more for this car if we welcome loans into it. So now the person who sells cars is going to go, yeah, I like that deal. The banks are going to go, we really like that deal because it gets us involved. We get a piece. And now the consumer is left going, well, wait, this is the only option I have, right? And they're going to say, no, hey, we're helping you out too because we're going to make your monthly payments smaller so that now you can manage it. No,
Mm.
man, the wool was just pulled over your eyes.
Oh yeah,
Like
and
you just got hoodwinked,
for
and
sure.
this is a real problem. And it is a matter of justice.
Yep.
This is actually a point blank example of how an injustice corrodes a whole society and where they actually are. These are real tangible places where injustices do
Yep.
exist.
And that hits families hard too. I think the average car payment in the US has just gone over 1K now.
Oof.
1K per month on your car payment. Half of people on 100K in the US are living paycheck to paycheck. So you really see how, probably connected to the virtue of temperance and also fortitude again, people aren't actually managing to set and maintain those boundaries that honor themselves, their spouses, their kids, employees, whoever it might be. A lot
Yeah.
of this is reminding me of what we say in church every Sunday. Listen, it's all here. I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, because it's social, right?
Yeah.
That I have sinned through my own fault in my thoughts and in my words, in what I have done and in what I have failed to do. So this is all about justice. It's what we owe God, ourselves, and others as well.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, the Ten Commandments all relate. So later on, when we talk about how does one grow in justice, and then I want to bring up the sort of virtue of satisfaction here in a second. But when we get to that, one of the things that I laid out is the third thing is to study the precepts of justice. Well, the first place for those is the Ten Commandments.
Mm.
All of the Ten Commandments pertain toward our dealings toward others, and so Thomas, rightly points out, even in the Summa, that a transgression against justice is fundamentally going to be a mortal sin according to its genus, because he circles back to mortal sins are sins against charity, love of God, love of neighbor. And so every sin of justice, which is going to be, toward the other individual, it's going to be murder, adultery, theft, and slander or lies about their name, which they have a right to, right? All those are going to, according to their genus, be mortal sins.
Mm.
Right. And so again, this is where all this stuff is relevant. All this stuff that we're doing, the mass, it has meaning, the things that the church teaches, the things that it has taught, right? These things are all relevant. It is good to regulate your body, right? But there's not a commandment. One of the 10 commandments is not, don't overeat food. Right? It's good to not overeat food, but again, it's dealing with, okay, what's going to be mortal, and that has to do with how we comport and interact with others.
Yeah. And you can see how an alcoholic, for example, or drug addict, if he doesn't exercise temperance, is going to end up being unjust towards his family because he can't carry out his duties toward them. So, although
Yeah,
it's not
yeah,
there in the Ten Commandments, if you are damaging your physical health enough, then you're not going to be able to honor yourself, the people around you, or ultimately God as a
Or
result of
God.
that.
Yeah.
So that's why these things are deeply connected. We've covered a little bit about what justice means in speech and in action, and how we have it in these intimate relationships that we have, whether it's with wives or with children, with parents too. It can be also in
Yeah.
the workplace as well. But you mentioned God there, and to me, this is one of the biggest misconceptions about religion that I see, especially in young guys today, that it's somehow wishy washy and mainly about whether you happen to feel something when you open the Bible or not. And they just sort of shut their eyes and wonder whether they're going to get this religious sensation. But it's fundamentally about justice. It's a real set of hard, cold facts about what we owe to God and the existence of God, as the Catholic Church teaches, as even Aristotle, not as a Christian, proved as well with the unmoved mover. The existence of God is something that can be known with certainty by the light of natural reason. We don't know all the things about God just from natural reason alone, but we can know that he exists. And from there, we realize that we got to take religion with the utmost seriousness. And it's about justice, what we owe the creator.
Yeah, my wife has testified that one of the biggest things that struck her, when we got together, and she's fallen away Catholic at the time, she's like, when I go to mass, I just don't, I don't really feel anything. It doesn't really do anything for me. And the first thing I said is, oh yeah, it's not for you. The first thing I said is, no, no, no. Mass is about justice. It's about giving to God his due worship. So whether I'm in a good mass or a bad mass, whether I have a good, priest up there, a good homilist giving a good sermon or not, whether it's got good music or not, I'm not at mass about me, right? And don't get me wrong, I love a reverential mass. I mean, it satisfies the soul and its longings in a much deeper way. I think it draws out a pure form of gratitude toward God. But that being said, I view it as the Lord knows my heart and this reality. I view it as a voluntary penance when I have to sit through a mass when I'm traveling, and they pull out the guitars and whatnot. And so it's on me to be there and bear witness to the worship of God at that
Mm,
time,
mm.
right? And it's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do every single day. The Lord makes it easy for us. He says, all right, once a week. That's my hard and fast parameter, but it's a good thing to do every single day. So there's never a point where it's like, oh, okay, well, I did that once a week, I'm good to go. It's like, no, if you're going to daily mass every day, and your mass on Sunday, like, okay, now you're in the right comportment of worship toward God, of giving thanks toward God. There's
Yeah.
no there's no excess in that. That's not someone who's overdoing it, or they're just
No.
excessively pious like that. That's actually closer more to like a baseline. Like
Yeah.
that's like a baseline good. And
It's
so that was the first thing, is like, yeah, sorry. That was the first thing though with my wife that really
yeah.
struck her, where she was like, oh, and then she started to realize how everyone she knows looks at it that way. Oh, it doesn't do anything for me. It's not about you. It's about what
Yeah.
you're giving to God.
Right. And you raise a really important point there because, properly speaking, you can't have too much religion because the
Yeah.
debt we owe
Yeah.
is infinite.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to throw this one in too. I think, is a blessing in my life that I am someone who largely read and thought my way into the church.
Same.
I mean, no, I didn't know anyone who was Catholic that was, practicing Catholic. It wasn't, some people, they go to mass and they're like, oh, the experience I had, it transformed me. I noticed, I realized that Jesus was really present there. Mine wasn't. Mine was reading and thinking my way in. So when it clicked for me that I believe that Jesus was God, I would say that's kind of the intellectually, that was the piece that had to fall into place, is that consubstantiality clause, that Jesus is God.
Mm,
Then for me, it was a short step from there to say, okay, the Catholic Church is his church. It's where it's been there for 2,000 years. If I believe that Jesus is God, it's not about what I think. I'm not trying to have religion fit me. I'm trying to conform myself to it. And so I very quickly realized, oh, okay, I need to go to a Catholic church, to mass, right? And give worship to God, not because not because it'll make me feel good, but because this is what this literally, God is literally there. It's been there. Christ has been there for 2,000 years in
mm,
that church. I need to
mm,
go to it. I need to learn from it. I need to humble myself before it. right? And so luckily for me, yeah, I wasn't someone who was like totally transformed by an experience at mass. For me, it was that conviction of the will that this is how I need to comport myself to it. And so basically from the get-go, I think I had the right mentality in mass. I was never one looking for the right the most beautiful mass. I remember right away early on, I was kind of like, well, which, like right away, I was kind of like, well, which church do I go to? And immediately I was like, oh, no, that would undermine that principle. It's not for me. It's about it. So what was nice is we actually have a beautiful cathedral in St. Paul, Minnesota. Beautiful, probably one of the more beautiful churches in all of America. And it was 2 miles from my house. And I was like, well, I'm just going to go there. It's the biggest, most beautiful church, that I've seen or been around. A lot of people compared it. It's like a slightly miniature version. I mean, it's huge, but it's a slightly miniature version of European churches. So I was like, well, I'm just going to go there. I'm going to go there. So I just started going there. And that's where I was brought into the church. And that, to me, it set me on the right path in my orientation toward mass, toward worship.
Mm.
And so that's hopefully that example kind of furnish some people where it's like mass, it's really about that matter of justice. Worship, prayer, these things are matters of justice. When God gives us the spiritual consolations, awesome, cool, great, but he's also going to pull those at times because he wants to perfect the will.
Yeah. When you were talking there about reading and thinking your way into the church, I was just thinking about the fact that will follows intellect. And it was really about the submission of your intellect to the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. That's fundamentally what faith consists in, which is why Aquinas talks about how if we deny faith in one area, you deny what the church teaches in one area, then you're denying the whole thing, because it's about the submission of the intellect to the authority of God. He who hears you hears me. That's what it's about fundamentally. There's a lot that's really similar to how I came to the church as well, because I wasn't raised Christian. And I've said it a few times, the early 20s, I was Nietzschean, and then that, if you think about it deeply enough, just ends in incoherence. And then it was moving from that to classical theism. So Aristotle and God exists and the immateriality of the soul. But once you've got those two things in the background, in the philosophical foundations of your worldview, God exists, the soul's immortal, the intellect's immaterial, then the resurrection and the claims of Christianity specifically, you don't really have any strong arguments against them any longer. They fit within that framework so much more easily than they do within the Nietzschean framework or whatever else it might be. So that's how I followed those steps. And shout out to Professor Edward Fazer when I was in my early 20s, really kindly answering a couple of emails that I sent him, because I was teaching at the time, and we had to cover the distinction between a fact and a value. And some of the stuff in the curriculum, I was just really scratching my head over how to explain it clearly to young kids, because you have to nail something to be able to explain it clearly to really young kids. And it was this idea that, like, okay, so the atomic weight of sodium is a fact, is it? But then the wrong of murder is a value. So if it's a value, is it not a fact? So it's not a fact that murder is wrong. And that just threw open the whole question of virtue ethics for me and objective morality. And that's when the Nietzscheanism really started just falling apart, because they can't ground it. No atheist philosophical worldview can ground morality properly. They can believe it psychologically, and they will do if they are sane, but they can't actually ground it metaphysically.
Right, and that's where their principle tends to become, well, I don't need the 10 commandments to tell me that murder is wrong, which is true because it's according to the natural law.
Written in the heart.
But here's what's interesting. Yeah, but here's what's interesting. They then don't think it's wrong if you do an abortion.
Mm.
Right? So even the principle of murder, they can't actually see that with clarity. They would think that, everything in consensual sex is permissible so long as it's consent. Like that's going to be their unifying principle. Then it's like, well, okay. I mean, some of them do take it to the extreme where they go, that's why an affair is not wrong. That's why pedophilia is not, not wrong, because if
an
it's
interesting example on that would be that just like you could consent to donate your organs for medical research after death, what if you consented for your body to be used by a necrophiliac after you died? What's wrong with that? It's not
Yeah, right.
hurting anyone, right? No, but of course it is, because it's hurting the necrophiliac. It's bad for
Yeah.
him.
Yeah,
Like
it's bad
it's
for his
not just
soul.
about
Yeah.
consent. The consent based morality is like cultural cancer, and there's
Right,
nothing
right.
good that can come of it. It's not about what you happen to consent to.
Right. No, and that's my point, is that the atheist tries to carve out territory basically on those two principles, is like murder and consent. And what we're saying is that even that, it falls apart for them. They can't even clarify that the murder of a child is murder, right? So they can't even see that with clarity. They
Mm,
can't navigate, for example, it's like, yeah. So for them, by the way, because the murder is the innocent killing of another person, right? So we don't have to talk about war or death penalty or things like that, which even that, of course, then they go and get all twisted on itself. But the killing of an innocent person, there's no way that you can ever arrive at a position where a child in a womb is anything but innocent. There's no moral action taking place, right? So there's no moral agency yet in that. So there is no possibility of anything but innocence in a child. And so if you permit of it for whatever reason, the good of the mother, whatever it is, all right, which also I've been thinking about this lately, what a critique of society it is that we value the mother who's, 20, 30, whatever, how many years old, and the child who is the sort of vehicle of the future, the sort of avatar of the future, right? A child is future oriented. Throughout all of history, in any healthy society, you would value your future over the decaying present, right? But that's a sort of sidebar. But so my point is that even in that, they can't even arrive at justice rightly.
mm.
So the atheist, it really does. It's a sort of irreducible irresolution, because it's
Of
just, you end
course.
up in this place where it's like you can't even hit those things
No.
correctly. And
Well,
so then all left is just your gut instinct. You know
yep.
what? I think that this is wrong. And yep, you have a conscience, but that's warped at this point.
Yep. That's true. And of course, you can't have objective meaning, value, or purpose, and there's no way in which you can fit justice into that. That you're never going to
Yeah.
do it. And I
Yeah.
just wanted at this point to read a couple of verses from scripture. So in the book of
Yeah.
Isaiah,
Please.
we read, his own justice supported him. He put on justice as a breastplate. So that's in God. Justice is a virtue that is specifically dealing with how he treats his creatures. So we can have no real well founded complaint against God whatsoever.
Yeah.
His
Yeah.
own justice supported him. He put on justice as a breastplate. And then we're also taught that blessed are they that hunger and thirst after justice. So, in that
Yeah.
sense, it's just like the general virtue of holiness, being a good man in the way that you described earlier. And then we've also got holiness as a kind of supernatural life that's communicated to the soul. That's also justice. And we read that the justice of God by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all them that believe in him in Romans. So that
Yeah.
just connects what we're talking about here to what the actual the final end of human beings is, like why justice matters. It's not that virtue is the goal in life. It's that actually it helps us on our journey. It keeps us on the right path so that we get to the goal in the end.
Yeah. When you said the blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. I'm thinking I had a great, comment, observation from a priest in confession a while back, where I was like, I come in, I'm confessing amongst other things, but it's like, I think this person did this thing and it troubled me. And I think I've just been holding on to a sort of bitterness, and the priest goes, okay, good. Okay, good. But at the end they go, hey, for your penance, I want you to meditate, reflect, spend a few minutes reflecting, 3 to 5 minutes reflecting on the beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. And I think it was the priest's subtle way of saying, yeah, it's good that you're here sort of regulating that, trying to incline more generously toward others, but also understand that inclination for justice is a good thing. That you seeing that they've done something wrong and being upset with it is a hungering and thirsting for justice. And blessed are those who do that, for they shall be satisfied. They will see in God the perfect justice of all things, right? If you're young and your thing is the injustices in the world, and you want to see justice done, build on that,
Mm.
right? See it through, because oftentimes there's logical conclusions that don't add up, but that inclination toward wanting a more just world, toward the soul yearning for justice, for that sort of perfect balance of things where things are rewarded perfectly and rightly and punished perfectly and rightly. Like, cultivate that. Don't stamp that out. Cultivate it, and now perfect it and direct it toward God, not
Yeah.
just arbitrarily, but because God is good. Like we said, faith is that submission of the intellect to God because it comes from God and you believe that God is good,
And this is the
right?
reason
Otherwise,
why uh, when we
yeah,
die,
yeah,
we get the particular judgment, but then there's also the general judgment as well, where you get to
yeah,
see that perfect justice is done for the whole of human
yeah,
history, like everything done
everything.
perfectly, every
Yeah,
single last detail, like you know it all.
yeah, yeah,
So the particular and the general judgment. That's why thirsting after justice is ultimately satisfied by that. And for most people, the particular judgment is going to end in purgatory. And you are grateful for that because it's
yeah,
exactly what you need perfectly. The exact kind of punishment to actually improve you. Comes back to the classroom example at the beginning where
yeah,
it's good for the kid to have the strict teacher because you're actually bringing the best out of him. And this idea that punishment is about reform and we can be grateful for it, spare the rod, spoil the child. Well, God is going to give us the tough times and punishment that we need to actually satisfy for our sins because He hates our sins because He loves us and He actually wants to perfect us through the punishment. It's a hard thing for people to get their head around when they think that being good is the same thing as being nice, but it's not.
yeah. No, and that's, I mean, that's such a holy impulse. The way you put it there is like to see purgatory as, again, this good, like this is something that can make me more prepared to receive God. And by the way, heaven is about God. I've always said it to people. I've had a conversation briefly with Tim on his channel about predestination, and really, I mean, I think it's a huge subject. I think it's one so many people really get wrong. But again, the way that it all reconciles is that it is about God. All of faith, all of this life is about God. The afterlife is about God. And the thing is that won't be a disappointing thing. That'll be the source of its perfection, right? So I've been reflecting on this because people pass away, and have people I know that have passed away, and it's like, okay, were they in a state of faith? Man, no. I mean, just bluntly, like, no. I think in our modern age, I've been reflecting on this too. I think that one of that when we talk about the modernist heresy, I think that within the church, I think it's something like the heresy boils down to a disordered understanding of conscience. I actually think that that's the locale of the sort of modernist heresy for those who actually remain in the church. Yes, we have a full frontal attack outside of the church, at sort of the basis of belief, but I think within the church, it's a disordered understanding of conscience. But I say it because it's like a lot of in our modern society, we spend a lot of time thinking, well, if this person died, are they in heaven? Are they not? There's a certain point where it's like, okay, first off, if you know them personally, then that's good. Pray for them. That's fine. God sees all things before all time. That's worthwhile. Do that. But outside of that, it's like it's in God's hands now. Turn your focus back on God, right? And you don't have to belabor where are they at. Just trust that God is good and just, and that at that point, once you're now dealing in the afterlife, it's about God and it's about turning toward God,
Mm.
right? And so it's not, oh, I want that person to be saved. I want what God wants. I want what God wants, right? I want what is right and just and perfectly good and perfectly merciful in God, right? I don't want, some thing that would undermine any piece of God. I don't need an inordinate desire for another's quote unquote good that undermines God, right? I say
Hmm.
quote unquote good because it couldn't be their good if it undermines God. But
Yep.
it's like, just turn that gaze on God. So I don't know. That's just a reflection I've been sort of
Yeah.
patiently, slowly going through over. I would say this last month or two or so. Just that
Yeah.
realization. All right, after one's life, turn the focus toward God.
Well, the principle there goes back to the order of charity we were talking about earlier, where it's God at the top, and then the next is self, actually, which is
Yep.
controversial
Yep.
for people to hear because love your neighbor as yourself. Love of self
Yep.
is the standard for love of neighbor. And the way you truly love yourself is by giving everything that you owe to God, because that's
Yep.
spiritually good for you. And then next is going to come your wife if you're married, and
Yep.
then it will be your kids, and then your parents, and then it will
Yep. Then
be
your
people
siblings.
like siblings, exactly, and then extended family, and then it will be your benefactors, and then strangers. So people don't get that order of charity right, and if you put anything else apart from God at the top, you're not going to be loving yourself properly. And if you're not doing
Yep.
that properly, then your ability to love your neighbor is also going to be disordered too. And I always like seeing, if it's a Novus Ordo Mass, when the priest is ad orientem, so when the priest is
Yeah.
facing away, so everybody remembers, right? That's what we're focusing on. This whole thing is about God. I think that's such a powerful way for the priests who are doing Novus Ordo, but I think some of them probably still have that deep attachment to TLM. They'd rather be doing that, but at least they face away. And it just makes people recognize that Mass is about God fundamentally, not them. The priest is not saying, look at me, I'm the performer. He's back to them.
Yeah. He's leading them. We're all going together.
Right.
I mean, no, again,
Exactly.
those are, symbolically, I mean, those are the things that to me draw the most reverence, the most awe, the most humble submission,
Mm,
subjugation to God is those things. And those are the really, meaningful things. And like I said, along with, luckily they actually, one thing people point out is that when the church started allowing for vernacular music, the the English and American Catholic churches were very benefited by the Anglican tradition of music. So it can be, at times I realize it can be hard for Americans or English speaking people to recognize the sort of corrosive effect of the Novus Ordo if they're in an English American church that deals that actually plays a lot of music that's high Anglican music. So they've got the organs. It's quite beautiful. And so I know, like for me, I mentioned, I started going to this cathedral. I mean, it's just beautiful music. It's beautiful organs. The cantors are phenomenal singers. I mean, they're classically trained singers, opera type level singers. And so you're in there, and the heart swells for it,
mm,
But the difference is, what they said is that in the other traditions they didn't have. In Italy, they had no tradition of of vernacular music that was like reverential. So it totally undermined the whole process of the mass. And apparently it was is very similar to it in the French church, right? And so yeah, I mean, these are sidebars here, but related to this matter of justice, to giving worship to God,
mm.
right? To giving thanks to it. Again, it's so edifying when the church turns around toward it. I mean, the other thing is the prayers in Latin. When they're translated to English, it's not it's not the same mass. A lot of our audience will know that from seeing things like Mass of the Ages and other resources like that. But it's not just the same prayers, and the Latin Mass is much more ordered toward one's fault, toward justice, toward giving to God, toward repentance. And these are all good things to cultivate, and on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, are really good things to cultivate. And so for the in that sense, it's like the church eventually will have to gear back toward it, because over time it gears back always toward what is truest and best and most beautiful.
Right. Exactly. And talking about what we have to cultivate, we've got a list of 3 things that we think people wanting to become more just should really focus on. And
Yeah.
remember, the just man is basically just the good man, the man who's real, who you can depend on, who does his duties. And remember that humility is actually about being keyed into reality,
Yeah.
understanding who you are, what you owe the people around you. So, first thing is the virtue of satisfaction. If you
Yeah.
treat someone in a way that you shouldn't have, or you fail to treat them in the way that you should have, then try to make restoration for that and
Yep.
compensate them for that as well. And if it's public, then that restoration should be public as well. If you offend
Yep.
someone in a way that is unjust in front of a big group of people, then you better make sure that your apology is also in front of that same big group of people as well.
Yeah. You'll see this a lot with people where they offend publicly and apologize privately. That's a matter of injustice,
Yep.
especially if they're in a leadership position,
Yep.
right? That's probably where it's most likely. They offend publicly, they're in a leadership position, they offend publicly, and then they try and restore it privately. But yeah, just to lay it out for people, there's sort of three principles to that virtue of satisfaction. The first is restoring what was taken. So let's kind of put this in terms of money. You steal $20. All right. The first thing is you give back the $20. The second piece of satisfaction is compensation. So that's giving back. And what Moses, the law of Moses said is 1/5 of what was taken should be added back as compensation. All right. And the law of Moses in its dynamics of justice is perfect, right? And that's, you can always rely on that. That's something that's lost nowadays that Thomas hits on so well, is like, Moses is the meekest man who ever lived, and he receives the law from God. So what he's communicating is God. And so there's this great balance of justice involved in the Mosaic law. All right. But so the first piece, you restore it. Second piece, you compensate roughly 1/5 more. Now, if it's in speech, and you don't have that easy quantifiable 1/5, it's something like, a kind word additionally. So you say that you were wrong, you offer a kind word additionally.
And the
Then the
thing, the
third,
thing that you've taken
yeah,
there is the person's reputation, right? Their honor.
yep, yep.
Yep.
And so then the third thing is, for the one who is well formed in that virtue of satisfaction, is to embrace punishment, to see that punishment as a good. You talked about it so well, highlighting purgatory. The person who has the right mindset begins to see how purgatory itself is good. All right, this, you can now see this virtue of satisfaction is what is modeled in the confessional. You admit you're wrong. You say sorry to God. Even in saying sorry to God, that actually operates as a form of compensation, a recognition of God as good,
Mm,
of pleading one's own cause. And then you take on your penance
mm.
voluntarily. You
And
see that penance as a good thing.
and it's good
And so
to be afraid
the
of going to hell, but most importantly, the thing that you have to despise is the fact that you've offended God, who is infinite goodness.
yeah, yeah. And so the person who is a just man has to cultivate that first. Just woman, whatever, a just human, they have to cultivate that first, that virtue of satisfaction, of restoring the wrongs that they've done, compensating for them, and seeing punishment as something good and enduring punishment accordingly, right?
Yep.
You can immediately tell if a student is more spiritually mature than another, not by how much they know or what they say, this and that. It's when they're punished, will they take on the punishment?
Mm.
Will they say, okay? Or do they try and slither and get out of the punishment? Fine, everyone's going to have a little bit of that inclination, but really the just man, what you want to try and cultivate in your children more than anything is that sense that they're willing to be punished for things,
Yep.
right? And that actually circles all the way back to our second, our third episode on humility, right?
Exactly.
That willingness to be punished is going to be probably the best sign of a person who has the virtue of justice.
Mm. And the next thing that we think people should work on is really concentrating on their speech. So be
Yeah.
just in your speech, which means being modest. And we want to avoid white lies. Most
Yep.
people aren't going to brazenly tell big lies, but white lies are so common that once you actually try to eradicate all of them, you really notice how much work you've got to do.
Yeah.
And if you concentrate on not flattering people, for example, then you recognize as well, oh, that's a habit that I'm into. So there's
It's
so much
hard.
work to do there. And it really makes you focus on the fact that you've got these bad habits and they're everywhere around you in the workplace, in wider society too. So you've got your work cut out there in particular.
Yeah.
So you were giving good examples earlier of making sure that you don't just blurt out the first thing that comes into mind regarding a behavior in someone else that you want to correct. Instead, you got to actually restrain it and make sure it's perfectly aligned with what you truly want to say and what they need to hear as a matter of justice. Because you can take the idea that the virtuous man, like St. Thomas says, must sometimes not shrink from bringing sorrow to those among whom he lives, and think, okay, right, it's time to get your feelings hurt, everybody. Get
Yeah.
ready for some sorrow. And you just start, you just start wheeling on everybody. No, that's not the right
All
way to
right,
do
kid.
it. Yeah, exactly. And it's actually very hard to correct someone and do it perfectly. And people give the example of
Yeah.
Christ flipping tables in the temple and whipping people. Right, but you wouldn't have been able to give the whipping like that. You wouldn't have done
Yeah.
it perfectly with just the right amount of anger. You'd have probably whipped too hard or not hard enough.
Or you wouldn't do it in the right place, right? He's in the temple where they've turned it into a den of vipers. They're, what they say is at that time, so you, in order to make your offerings, the sacrifices had to be done in the temple for them to be valid. They're constrained to place. All right, so they have to be done in the temple in Jerusalem, and in order to offer up a sacrifice, you had to have, the shekels. You had to have the formal coinage that was considered worthy to give to God. Well, what they were doing is they were defrauding people. So they would come with money, with animals, with all these things, and they would only give them. They would make them give, head to toe everything that they had in order to just get the small shekels so that they could make their offering. And so Christ is here saying, this is rightly ordered. No, this is exactly the wrong place to be doing this. Like, this isn't something that I need to be kind of on the edge about. By the way, he didn't go into Samaria or Galilee and start flipping over tables and whipping people, right? Right? It's not like every time he entered a place, he's like, I'm here, just throwing stuff over. Like that's not him. That's not his MO, right? That's not what he did. But in the right place and in the right context, he did it. And how many of us, we talked about this even last week. How many people want to mount, with fortitude? How many people want to mount the charge of something that's not even that hard to mount the charge against, right? But so again, it's like, all right, now you start to see, oh, okay, that's where Jesus, when he's flipping over the tables and whipping and driving them out, like, get out. You are cut off from this body, which is the temple, right? You need to leave. That whip is to say, you are getting out of here. And you are not you're not welcome here. All are
Exactly.
not welcome here, right? And that's because again, he understands, the just man understands circumstance, understands the degrees of wrongness, what aggravates an offense versus what mitigates it, right? And in that case, he's saying, no, this is fully aggravated.
Yep.
And that's why, yes, the tables are getting thrown over, the cords are being brought out for whipping. All right. And the only way you're getting spared from this whipping is if you run as fast as you can to get out of here.
Exactly it. And then this seems like a no-brainer, but people don't do it. Study the 10 Commandments and
Yeah.
also all the great commentaries on them, because
Yes.
the church teaches that the 10 Commandments are actually a clarification of natural law. Like, this is natural law just distilled into a really clear blueprint that everybody can understand, because fallen human nature being what it is, we even needed help to have natural law really clearly set out. If you look at what the pagan
Yeah.
philosophers were doing with morality, you've got even highly gifted minds like Aristotle and Plato rationalizing abortion, right?
Yeah.
And
Wow.
even the brightest pagan intellects, we still needed help from God. We can know the things in the 10 Commandments by natural reason alone, but to have them set out perfectly, succinctly like that, in a way that people like Aquinas can expand on and really flesh out,
Yeah.
that's so important for us to look at. And I don't think that that's taken seriously enough by most people who actually want to improve in virtue. Like, go back to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Study it, right? That's what we said. So our first one again was cultivate the virtue of satisfaction. The second one is be just in speech. All right, and then that third one, like you just said, study the precepts of
Yeah.
justice, and that fundamental text is the 10 Commandments. But the other one I always say to people, and I include in our show notes, is read the Law of Moses, read Deuteronomy. All right, I've mentioned this in a Substack before, but Ben Shapiro got absolutely humiliated by there's the British guy who's the atheist. What is his name? Alex something, Con
The
Conover.
young guy, yeah, he interviewed
Yeah.
Peterson
Anyways,
recently. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he ran circles around Ben Shapiro because all he had to do was to say, "Is slavery intrinsically wrong?" And Ben Shapiro's like, "Well, of course it is." Okay, so what's going on here in the law of Moses? Right? That's all he had to do. No, don't take your norm, modern, secular ethics and try and imprint it onto your concept of justice. Go back to Moses, humble yourself, become as a child, learn from them. All right. I always say you can't, there can't be an intrinsic evil in a sort of economic arrangement. All right. In terms of, again, there's an intrinsic evil to defraud another person. But in terms of boss, employee, ownership, things like that, there can't be it. Right. The principle, you can't deduce a principle there. Right. Some people will try, they'll try and say, well, a human person is such that they can't be owned. No, you can offer up your services for wages. And in a dispute, say there was a war, if people lost, it was completely naturally just for the people who lost to be subject now to the people who beat them. All right. And so I always say, like, go to the law of Moses, read it when it's saying, hey, punish this. You shall not suffer wizards, right? So wizards should be put to death. Okay. Now you have to understand the death penalty. It's not just this permissive thing. The death penalty is not just, oh, well, they weren't able to jail them imprisonment for life, comfortably and reasonably. So for them, they had to permit for that. That's not what's going on there. Read the law, study the law of Moses. In our Catholic Church, we probably need that more than anything. No, the sacrificial laws do not still hold, right? The civil laws, properly speaking, don't still hold, but the principles of those civil laws are gold, right? Don't go offer a sacrifice in the temple. First off, the temple doesn't exist and it is confined to place, right? But don't go observe the Mosaic law. Don't keep the Passover as if that will sanctify you, right? That's what we mean by that. Don't circumcise your child because you believe that will make him holy. That will undermine your baptism. You can circumcise them just because health reasons or aesthetic reasons, whatever you want, but don't do it for a sacramental reason,
Right.
right? So don't keep those, but read that law of Moses for all the details in there, because it will start to fine tune you. It will start to orient you toward justice, toward that reward and punishment for good things done and bad things done.
Exactly it. And I just want to finish on another thing that we mentioned that we wanted to bring up, which is that if you're a young guy and you're dating and you're thinking that maybe this woman is not going to be your future spouse, then it's an injustice to her to string her along and waste
Yeah.
years of her life when you've got no real intention of marrying her. And you're actually, if you take it a step further and you start sleeping with her, uh, that is
Yeah.
harming her far worse than you would be, even if you like punched her in the face or got her in a car crash because you were drunk driving. The spiritual damage that you're doing to her is a more serious injustice than either of those two things, a punch in the face or a car crash where you're a drunk driver, because her soul's more precious than her body is. And this
Yeah.
is just so common today that people don't recognize the fact that they're not treating her as she is owed. You're also harming yourself spiritually as well. You're not treating yourself as you should be. But it's just one of those things that, again, because liberalism tells people just do whatever feels good in the moment and they think it's consensual, why not? It's one of those things that is so common everywhere. People barely even notice it anymore.
Yeah. And every guy can intuit it. If a girl dated you just to use you, just to keep you around, just to avoid their boredom or for your money, you'd know that, well, that's wrong. Yeah, it is. It is wrong. And for you to date someone that you don't have an intention to marry, that you don't love, is a matter of justice. It's an injustice. It's wrong. It's going to degrade your soul. It's going to weaken. It's going to limit and in many ways preclude your opportunity to gain any of the other virtues. You got to get this stuff right. You gotta
Exactly.
you have to navigate these dealings with other things. You have to speak honestly. You have to be doing things with integrity and goodness. Without that, like I said, it's going to preclude the cultivation of the other virtues.
Right. And if you don't get it right before you are married, you're going to also
Oh
be
yeah,
going into your marriage with these bad habits that will mean that you can't get it right in your marriage either.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Anscombe has a great essay on contraception and chastity where she talks about the fact that contraception within marriage is actually even worse than
Yeah.
contraception outside it because it's a violation of the sacrament. So when you are
Yeah.
married, you're thinking about things like openness to life, so no contraception at all, not using NFP with a contraceptive mindset.
Yes.
Divorce is completely off the table. You burn the boats so that you're in this together till death
Yeah.
do us part. And you're not even looking at other women and fantasizing about them at all because that's adultery. That's mortal
Yeah.
sin. So a lot of people will go into marriage and get all those things wrong. They'll think we can just get
Yep.
divorced if it doesn't work out. We're going to contracept, and I'm going to flirt a bit with coworkers or look at girls in the gym, whatever it might be. And the more you're doing that, you're disrespecting your spouse and yourself and God.
Yep. Like you said, no physical affairs, obviously, but also no emotional affairs. You shouldn't be unloading to someone of the opposite sex. That's not. There's no place for that. That degrades your love. It's a matter that's a matter of injustice toward your spouse.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And put your wife above your kids as well within the family.
Yes.
Put your wife
Yes.
above
That's
your
huge.
kids. All right.
Huge. And really encourage them to put you as the husband above their kids, because for the mother especially, it's very tempting. Their bond to their kids is much more visceral and emotional, especially early on, and so it's
Mhm.
very easy with their dissatisfactions or their own struggles to flip onto that. So you have to encourage them as well,
Yeah.
regularly, repeatedly.
And you can't do any of this hard stuff that we are talking about unless you're putting God first in your life, because the reality is of the weakness of human willpower, that this blueprint that justice requires of us, we can't get it done. Like we can't even avoid venial sin without God's help. So you need to
Yeah.
pray, you need to have him first in your life, and he will help you to do it. Be ye therefore perfect. That's the bar. You can't get there
Yeah.
by yourself. And that's going to teach you humility. The more you take this seriously, the more you'll realize there's no way, given your own shortcomings, that you can get this done. You need help
Yeah.
and you have to pray for it. So if you're feeling those temptations, then first thing you do, you pray.
Yeah. You said it well too, with like the gossip, or just like, how many times we're thinking about things with others, or we're oh, what was it, white lies. When we try and cut out white lies, we realize how hard it is, right?
Mm.
All that stuff should bring you to a further awareness of the need of God's grace, his
Should bring you
divine
to your
assistance.
knees.
Yep. Yep. Because once you actually start working on it, then you realize how deep the roots go. And then
Right.
then it becomes obvious why you need God.
Yep.
And I always say, then when the church tells you that the sacrament of the Eucharist is receiving God and his healing, his balm, his help, now it goes, oh, okay, now I get it. I don't need to hear verbally that it's the body, blood, soul, and divinity. I believe the church and it tells me that it's helping me, and I know I need the help because
Hmm.
I'm aware
Hmm.
of it. I'm conscious of my sin. So,
Yep.
and the depths of it, even imperfectly, but to the degree I am conscious of it, I see how deep it goes.
And
All
this
right.
is
So I
why,
need that
if you want
help.
to see that concretely in a way you can understand and really hits home for your life, look at the lives of the saints, because you'll see
Yes.
that total dependence. Like Saint Philip Neri, he talked about this danger of looking at the saints' lives and thinking, "Oh, what a Chad Saint Augustine was, or whoever it might be."
Yeah.
No, he says it's about what God has done through his saints. The saints' lives
Yeah.
actually manifest that what God can do through us. That's
Yeah.
why we're to look to them.
Yeah. And the thing that gets you to being a saint isn't like, oh, you just really want to be good. It's really we've already hit on it. It's that willingness to suffer. It's that willingness to see God as, and his punishment as good. Because these are kind of the hardest things, are the things we're most averse to. So it's like you start to see that suffering is for your good, that God ordains it for
Mm,
your good. You start to see how fully you need God's help by bringing a consciousness to one's sin, to all those layers of the sin. You're on your path. You're on the path. That's the key. That is actually the key. That will open the doors to sainthood. It'll be seeing those things. It's
right.
not like, oh, I need to go work at this, foundation, or do this thing, or go on this missionary. By the way, because all of that sprung from people who have internalized these other things we're talking about for years, for decades. And then they get to that place where God has now prepared them and disposed them and says, yes, now I'm going to send you, Mother Teresa, into the heart of Calcutta to deal with the sick, because you're going to so truly see the soul and the good of the soul and the need of charity in the lives of people. You're going to see it with so much clarity. It's going to overwhelm you. You're going to be brought into this position,
Right.
right? So that's then when the public acts follow in its wake,
And
right? But the first part, yeah,
that's what we really owe in justice, isn't it? To each of us become a saint. That's what we owe God,
yeah,
and also each other as well.
yeah. The law of charity is exactly, it needs to be our guiding principle.
Mm.
And there's not, yeah, there's not like a disunity between like the natural law and the law of charity. No, it's the full perfection of it. Because
Mm.
like we said, it's a matter of justice to worship and love God. Well, the
Mm.
principle of charity is love of God,
Right.
and then love of neighbor for the sake of loving God, right? So again, there's not a discontinuity. There's not some, some gap or something. It is the fulfillment of it.
Exactly. And next week, what we'll look at is prudence, which is ranked
Yeah,
first because it's actually about how to bring all this about. So we've gone up
yeah,
through the list, starting at the bottom, and then prudence is at the top next time. And I'm really looking forward to that. I think it will
yeah,
answer a lot of questions for people about how to develop the kind of skill to make these decisions off the cuff quickly in daily
yeah.
life, because that's what it all comes down to. You need to get that practical wisdom and judgment.
Yeah. Oh, I can't wait for. I've been excited for prudence the whole way through. We had to lay the groundwork though, but that's
That's
gonna
it.
be that's gonna be a
Right.
really good one.
Great. Good to speak to you again, AJ. Looking forward to
Yeah,
next
you too,
week.
buddy.
Take care. God bless.
See ya.